It's live.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, my name is Aiden Carpenter, and I'm an intern here at the Center for Research in Vermont. Today, I will be sitting and interviewing Pablo Bose as part of our ongoing interview series. Right now, the series is focusing a lot on sustainability and diversity in Vermont. Pablo does a lot of work with refugee, God, how do you even say it? Refugee migration here? Yeah.
Mhm. Resettlement.
Resettlement, yeah, that's the word. Refugee resettlement here in Vermont. And I'm very excited to talk about it. I think Vermont's changing and you are doing a lot of the change here. Is there anything you want to say about yourself? Introduce yourself?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this work. I've been here at UVM for 14 years now. I came here for a 2-year postdoc and then ended up staying. I'm in the Department of Geography and Geosciences. I'm involved with a bunch of different things at UVM. So I'm part of the Gund Institute on Environment, Center for Rural Studies, part of food systems. I've done research with the Transportation Research Center, a lot of different things on campus. I teach courses on race and ethnicity, on India, on migration. I had done a lot of work before I came to UVM on large cities, places like New York, Toronto, London, and I had done a lot of work on immigration into those kinds of places. And I'd done a lot of community-based work. And so then I came to Vermont, and I was like, well, where am I going to find large cities? Where am I going to find large, kind of racialized populations? And I discovered that there was a refugee community that had been here for 40 years at that time. And I got really interested in why. So, why were there refugees in Vermont? What happened to them when they came here? And what happened to Vermont as a result of them coming here? And what I discovered was that this is not limited to Vermont, that this was something that was very similar in other kinds of places across the US, in Canada, in Europe. And so I've done a lot of work looking at those questions in lots of different places.
Okay. I guess let's talk a little bit more about you. So, like, where are you from? What does the path, like the full path to Vermont look like for you?
Yeah, sure. So I was born originally in India, and my family moved from India when I was very young to Canada and lived there for a few years while my parents were students. Then we moved back to India, finally emigrated back to Canada when I was 10. And I grew up mostly on the West Coast in Vancouver, eventually moved to Toronto to do graduate school. And then the reason I ended up with in Vermont was a real set of coincidences. The person who was the dean of the faculty that I was doing my PhD in had been the chair of the Department of Geography at UVM and kind of put me in touch with people here. And it just sort of worked out. And as I said, I was only going to come here for a couple of years, but I ended up out here. My undergrad, so I've had a kind of circuitous route. I was originally, I did my undergrad in English and history, very traditional kinds of disciplines. Wasn't intending to stay in school after that. I worked for a number of years in actually in the entertainment industry in Vancouver as a writer. Eventually went back to school, did a master's in communications. So my master's is in communications, looking at environmental advocacy. Um, and then I worked in another totally different field. I worked in video game development for a few years.
Yeah.
And then I did a PhD in environmental studies. So a very kind of interdisciplinary route. But environmental studies is kind of adjacent to geography in different ways, and so that's how I ended up in geography here. As I said, I've done all kinds of interdisciplinary research, mostly with refugees and migrants, but on issues like food, housing, transportation, civic integration, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah. I guess to start talking about some of the work you do up here with refugees. So, when did that really start? And well, I guess one, what does that work look like right now?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, I'll say the way it started was when I had been in Toronto, where I was doing my PhD. I had been really involved with the Center for Refugee Studies
Hmm.
because the work I was doing there was more focused on when people get pushed out of wherever it is they live by conflict, environmental change, all sorts of different things. But I'd also been doing work, community based work, in the neighborhoods I was living in, which had pretty large, primarily Somali populations. And so I'd done a lot of work on like kind of what it looked like to be resettling. And so when I first came here, a couple of the projects I did right away, I got funded by the US Department of Transportation to do a couple of
Okay.
studies of what it looked like, what refugee mobility looked like. So that was a couple of the early projects that I had done.
Could
Um,
you define that, like refugee mobility? What does that exactly mean?
I mean, in this particular case, it was like directly where is it that refugees wanted to, what their options were. But really, I was fundamentally interested in what did constraints on mobility or opportunities either open up or close down, right?
Hmm.
So it wasn't simply do you have a car or does the bus get you where you need to go, but what are the implications in terms of your job prospects, education, those kinds of things. I'm actually today working on a grant proposal for a project that looks at the implications on food security of transportation barriers. So what does that sort of look like? So, that's been kind of a ongoing theme for me. Um, I do a lot of this kind of community-based work. My main partner now for over 10 years has been an organization called the Association of Africans Living in Vermont, or AALV, which is one of the two main refugee serving organizations in Vermont. There's actually a third that's come online now, and I've done a lot of work. So I do a lot of work both locally and nationally and internationally. So right now, what are the projects I'm doing? I'm doing a series of things locally on refugee youth programs in Winooski, on refugee youth mental health services that ALV is doing, the stuff on transportation, food. During the pandemic, I've been working with the food bank to look at food delivery programs for new Americans, telemedicine access, healthcare more generally for new Americans. Internationally, I've been involved with collaborators looking at everything from COVID-19 and refugee camps. I just put in a proposal to the State Department that would look at how the three largest refugee camps across the world in Jordan, Kenya, and Bangladesh, how they dealt with COVID-19 in their
Mm.
camps, environmental risk in refugee camps. And the other big project I'm starting this summer is looking at the resettlement of Afghan refugees in
Mm.
places like Brattleboro, but all across the US. So there I'm working with national organizations and partners to look at them both on the ground and kind of more broadly.
Okay. I guess to pick, like, I don't even know where to pick. There's so many things, and I feel like you have your hands in so many pots. It's interesting that you're looking at refugees from both, like, well, from so many different aspects, from like where they're originally coming from and what's pushing them out, then like what it looks like when they're still like in camps and what it looks like in those conditions. But then even to get them like to the US, and then from there, what are the implications of like their life and how you can actually assist them. It's amazing, actually amazing to just follow that entire process.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in not just one part of the migration journey. And I mean, the reality is that even if you were to look at refugee camps, a very small portion of the people who are in a camp are ever going to end up being resettled for all sorts of different reasons. We're right now having a big question about what happens with Ukrainians, right?
Yes.
Because there's been this big, you know, last week the Biden administration announced that they were going to take 100,000 refugees, and it's not when you look beneath the surface, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not like the like we're going to turn around, I don't think, and just resettle 100,000 people for all sorts of reasons. So those kinds of dynamics are really, really interesting to you kind of look at and engage in. So, but I've always been fascinated by that question of how do people and places change each other. So living here in Burlington, you know, it's been really interesting to see the children of Bosnian and Vietnamese and Somali and Bhutanese and Burmese and Iraqi communities begin to really, not just the children, but like it's been interesting for me because I increasingly have more students from these different
Mm,
communities. I see them taking up leadership roles in schools and in, you know, local organizations, and so it's really been pretty interesting and inspirational in lots of ways.
mm, inspirational. But I agree. No, I do agree. Seeing like your actual impact and seeing like these people here happy, living, thriving, not just surviving, but thriving. I guess to dig into the complexities of what does the work actually look like in terms of the groundwork of the people who are here in Vermont in terms of assisting them and making sure they have all of the, I don't want to say amenities, but the things you need to like comfortably enjoy life here. What does the work look like?
That is a great question. I mean, I would say first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges is that we, in general, and this is not just in the US, but there are certain barriers that are put in the way of immigrants and refugees that make it more challenging. There's a lack of recognition of capacity within communities where either through like all sorts of reasons that, you know, they're kind of racial hierarchies that are imposed upon refugees and immigrants who arrive, linguistic barriers, class, gender, you know, all of these sorts of things make it, you know, like on a very you know, tangible level, the fact that we don't recognize the kinds of credentials or education or
Yes.
experience that immigrants and refugees come in with often a real barrier. Um, Often a very kind of patronizing view of people. It's a waste of capacity. It's a waste of ability and resources when we just don't recognize some of the things, or even think about like, well, what is it that people are actually asking for? I remember sitting in a community meeting, and it was with an organization that was like, we're going to teach refugees about this, and I'm like, they don't need to be taught about that. Like, why don't you ask them what their questions are? And you know, so there's sometimes mismatches like that. There's a lot of starts and stops. There are things that you try out. There are things that work and they that don't. There are programs that are pretty amazing. Programs that are less amazing. So it's been really interesting to see what has been developed over the years. ALV, for example, is I think a really exemplary organization. That's not to say that there aren't things that they can't improve and things that need to be, you know, changed. It's interesting to see the new refugee organization that's coming in, or that has come into Brattleboro. That's a
Mm,
whole different model of settlement than what we do up here in northern Vermont, or in most of the U.S. as a whole. It's a different model of community-based resettlement. So there's a much closer connection with, alignment with community organizations off the bat.
mm.
Um, it's developed in a different way here in Chittenden County for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, so that's been really interesting to watch.
I would love to dig into that difference more. Like, one, what does the work look like up here in Chittenden County between like Burley and Winooski? But I think also down in Brattleboro, because that is the new one. Like,
Yeah.
What does that look like?
I mean, one of the big differences is, just the structure of U.S. resettlement. And I'll put it this way that, we had a U.S. refugee resettlement program that between 1980 and 2017, 2016, had developed in a particular kind of way that relied on these large national organizations that resettled people and then relied in many ways on local partners to
Mm,
carry forward the work. But there were lots of gaps and lots of holes, which is why actually an organization like ALV exists in the first place. That there was this kind of sense of like, well, there are things that, those large national organizations and their affiliates and field offices aren't able to do. So how do we fill in those gaps? I think one of the big differences is that, so in the case of Burlington, Brattleboro, it's actually the Ethiopian Community Development Council. That's the
mm,
national partner that's working with local partners in Brattleboro. And from the outset, they're trying to imagine some different kinds of relationships. They're trying to make it more integrated, not in sort of volunteer networks, but other kinds of local networks. And I don't know exactly what that difference is and whether it works better. That's actually the project that I'm working on with Open Society Foundation and the Shapiro Foundation. So I'm having these kinds of conversations about like how do we understand that? In fact, the meeting I had with them yesterday, they kind of told me short term, these are the things we want to learn. How do you develop a research agenda around that? Then there are long term questions and there are medium term questions. And like, in the short term, we're trying to make a case for community based, or they're asking me to try and show them if the State Department wants to continue investing in this form of resettlement, how do we show the value of these kinds of
mm.
things? So for me, it's coming up with things like how do you quantify certain kinds of non-economic benefits? How
Yes.
do you actually show whether or not something is working? What are the goals that you have? One concrete example I'll give you is this. When I started doing this work, I saw that the only kind of measure we had for whether or not resettlement was a success was a very limited economic measure. We asked whether or not people had a job after 90 days and whether or not they had a job after 180 days. And that's because the resettlement programs we have in the US are really founded on two principles. One, security. Will someone we let into the US be a threat? And there's
Yeah.
whatever some people are worried about who are these people, where are they coming from, are they going to be terrorists or whatever. There's just
Yeah.
no evidence of that whatsoever. There's a million people who've been let into this country through refugee resettlement over the last 45, 50 years, and like three of them have ever been convicted of any kind of offense, but what of a
Yeah.
terrorist offense. So security isn't an issue, but the other big pillar is self-sufficiency. And the idea is that
Mhm.
people pay for themselves, right? You have to pay back your plane ticket. You have to, you're expected to stand on your own 2 feet within 8 months. That's crazy. As somebody who also immigrated to the US from Canada, it took a whole lot longer. Coming with a job, it took a whole lot longer than 8 months to get up and running, right? But
Yeah.
that's what we ask refugees to do. So that's all we did. We just measured, do they have a job? We didn't ask, is that the job that somebody wants? Does it match up with their skills, their education, their interests, all of those kinds of things. So one of the things I did in one of the projects I did earlier on was I tested out this model with a cohort of recently arrived people where I asked them a series of questions about what they wanted.
Yes.
What was the size of the house they wanted to live in? How many bedrooms? How much rent were they hoping to pay? What was the kind of job they wanted? Did they want to pursue education, their hourly wage, like all of these sorts of questions. I then came back a year later and asked them what happened. And then a year after that, a year after that. And that's the kind of model that we want to test at a much larger scale. What are the expectations and what are the outcomes? And is there a match or a mismatch there? As a way of kind of testing, like, what's going on? What is it that people are looking for and what are they achieving or not? So,
Mm. I guess sitting on that question of outcomes to like I think of course it's very clear what the outcome is for the refugees who are resettled and all the support they get. But to
mm.
dig down into why it's so important to do it for the wider community, like the wider Vermont community, could we talk about some of those outcomes in terms of bringing?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a great pivot. I mean, I would say a couple of different things. One is whenever we ask the question of why do we bring in refugees, right? Refugees are themselves beyond the sort of humanitarian motives and purposes and this and that, which, are obviously an important one. Refugee resettlement in places like the US or France or Germany or Scandinavia is fundamentally in the interest of the country that is resettling them. Because if you look at where refugees are going, and refugees are different from other immigrant groups in that the federal government says, at least for the first year, where you have to go. Right? There's much more direction than there is with any other
Mhm.
immigrant population. And so the federal government and its are able to direct refugees towards certain places rather than others. And what I found in the research that I was doing through a National Science Foundation grant between 2014 and 2019 was that a significant portion of people, a greater portion of people, were going to smaller towns like Burlington and secondary cities like Nashville, as
Really?
opposed to a New York or a Miami or a Chicago, the traditional kinds of refugee destination, or rather immigrant destinations.
Yes.
And in a lot of places like Vermont, and in a lot of places like the Rust Belt, in Ohio and Michigan or in Pennsylvania, if you are not getting refugees, you're not getting a ton of other immigrants. And in a lot of those places, they're aging, youth are leaving them. If you're not getting refugees or other immigrants, you are facing some serious demographic challenges. Your population is aging, your tax base is declining, your ability to maintain services is going down. You're losing people. Schools are under pressure because the population is dwindling. And
Mm.
so there is something that is fundamentally important in having this flow of people. When under the Trump administration, they cut and they cut and they cut and they cut the refugee program, as part of my research, I went to dozens of cities across this country, and I was having so many mayors and city managers contacting me and saying, "What are we going to do? We
Mm.
need these people to come." None of that is to downplay the kind of culture wars and Islamophobia and racism and all of these things that were going on. But it's also true that like I had people who were like, I don't care where someone comes from. I just need people to come to my town. And so, that's a big impact locally.
Yes.
In a lot of the towns that we see refugees have come, like Burlington, there's a clear positive impact.
Yeah.
There are lots of challenges for sure. But if you look at Utica, New York today, and you looked at Utica, New York 20 years ago, Utica, I don't know what it would have looked like if refugees had not come. Lincoln, Nebraska, um, Twin Falls, Idaho. Like there are so many places that I can think of. Bowling Green, Kentucky. There are
Mm.
many, many places that would be hard to imagine the rejuvenation of certain places, certain areas. Dayton or Columbus, Ohio, right?
Mm.
So all that said, one of the real structural issues in the refugee program before was that local communities didn't have a ton of say.
Mm.
And it's not about whether or not, the ham fisted way in which the Trump administration interpreted this was that local communities should have a veto. And it's not about like whether or not people are like, I don't want refugees coming from blah, blah, blah. It's that it's more that we have not traditionally given local municipalities and service providers enough preparation or resources to help with that integration process. That means putting in resources into schools to say, how do we make sure that there's linguistic support, cultural support?
Yeah.
That means saying, you know, we need very specific kinds of, we have a population that's coming in that's endured torture and trauma? How do you have mental health support services? So anyway, super long answer, but that's kind of,
No, that was a
yeah.
great answer. God, what was that? I really want to ask about like that local voice aspect in terms of making. So, how does like AALV really engage the local community in terms of giving them a voice and giving them the resources and actually connecting it beyond like the, oh, this is your neighbor now, but actually forming legitimate interpersonal relationships?
Excuse me. I mean, ALV does that. USCRI VT, what used to be called VRP, Vermont Refugee Resettlement, does it as well. They tend to be more focused on the initial resettlement.
Mm,
ALV doesn't do initial resettlement. They do tend to focus more on that kind of longer term. There are others. I mean, one of the things that we see increasingly is that people who have come through the resettlement process are themselves working within these kinds of organizations,
mm,
as well as in other things like Spectrum Youth and Family Services or King Street Youth, at the Howard Center, you know, at the hospitals, and like lots of different kinds of places. So those sorts of organizations increasingly, when you have people who are able to be insiders as well as service providers, I think that's really, really important. It's always a challenge, coming back to your question of like, how do you provide the voices of, quote, the community? Because there are diverse voices within every community. You know, I was having this interesting conversation with one of my students who's from the Bhutanese Nepali community, who was telling me, you know, one of the real challenges she found during um, the conversations around defunding of police and student uh, resource officers, or whatever they're called, in the, you know,
yeah.
the police in the schools. And she was saying, you know, one of the real challenges was that while there were youth in the schools who were advocating for defunding and especially removal of these officers, there were many people, many of the parents and many of the older community members who were absolutely opposed, and in fact wanted more police in the schools and wanted more, you know. And so, like, a lot of times these conversations are really complicated,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to race, right? There are assumptions that are made around what conversations to do with race, ethnicity, gender might be in immigrant communities, and assumptions about how, quote, progressive or left or whatever this might look like. And they're really much more complicated than I think sometimes, especially in a place like Vermont, where
Everyone's
they become
progressive.
so, well, it becomes so caricatured, right? You simply
Yes.
have the assumption that, like, oh, well, th- because you are a person of color, you must therefore hold this view. And that there is some kind of unified refugee or New American or even Bhutanese or Somali view. There are a multiplicity of perspectives, as there are in every community. And so it's hard. Like, how do you actually engage with communities? I mean, I'm thinking about that practically as I'm like writing this grant proposal which asks for community feedback. I'm like, okay, what do you think that looks like? Do we look at elite stakeholders and key informants? Do we do focus groups? Do we do a survey? Like, how do we actually go about
Yeah.
engaging? So,
No, I agree. I think that that aspect at the very end of you, like how do you actually do it, is important because no matter which technique you use, there's some type of flaw. Use a survey, not everyone wants to respond. You do a town hall, who can actually show up, who
yeah.
feels comfortable speaking. It's very hard, but no matter what, I think the work you do is so important.
Well,
And
thank you.
no, like legitimately, I think it's amazing talking to like a lot of the Burlington youth who are like either refugees themselves or first generation and their parents were refugees, and hearing the fact that they've been able to actually like make their way in the community and feel like Burlington is their home and they feel comfortable in some sense. As comfortable as you can be sometimes, but
Yeah.
they feel comfortable. And I know, like, whether you yourself or some of the organizations you worked with actually like were the ones to personally help them, just building that sense of community and building that idea that you are there to help people is so important and has
I mean,
worked.
I have to say, like, just to give a shout out to the refugee youth programs, and there are people like Samuel Dingba, who was a student here at UVM, and then um, then has been running this youth program. Vijayata Dahal, who's a student of mine, who's been working um, with young women in the refugee communities. Aiden Haji, who is a student here. There's a whole bunch um, of them who've been incredible. A bunch of the students themselves in middle school, high school students have created pathways for themselves in ways that I find remarkable. It is awesome to go and see some of these student groups and kids groups and the kinds of things that they've advocated for in Burlington, in Winooski, in Essex, in all sorts of different places, and not just from refugee backgrounds, obviously, from all kinds of different backgrounds, including those who are students of color from born and raised in Vermont, from all sorts of different backgrounds. It's definitely a challenge being in a place like Vermont. It's your role models or even yourself. I mean, I think about this in terms of my daughter growing up in
Mm.
Vermont is a different experience than she would have were she to live in a community with a larger, you know, a larger community of color. And so what does that kind of look like or mean? So, yeah, but it is, I said inspirational before, and I mean inspirational. Like, I'm always like, man, a lot of these kids have like way more grit and determination than I have today, and much less than I had when I was their
Yeah,
age. So, yeah.
I agree. Well, Pablo, thank you so much for joining me. This was very fun. I guess, of course, to hand the mic back to you, is there anything, like any final thoughts, anything you want to share, any project you're super excited and want to talk about?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I love the opportunity to speak, especially with students who are as engaged and as interesting as yourself. Those are some great questions. I'm excited about every project, which is one of my fatal flaws. Is like I have a hard time saying no, which is why I'm like, oh, I can do that. I can do that. And so I always need. I'll be honest. I could not carry out any of this research were it not for students who I have been able to work with. I'll shout out another student who is graduating this spring, Anitra Conover, who's been
Oh,
doing a ton of. Yeah, you may know Anitra. She
no,
is
I
like,
forgot she's graduating. Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So Anitra is another one of these amazing students who has just done a ton of stuff. I have many, many students I could point to, but again, she's been helping me with this food security research, and I have had students like that over the years. Many, many students who just kind of blow me away by what it is that they do. So, um, could not do this without their energy, their ability to rein me in on many occasions, and push work in ways that I would not imagine. So yeah, so that's the main takeaway for me. I love working with students, and this has been one of the really great things about being at UVM. Because we don't have a grad program in my department, I have
Mm.
developed this long term. I start working with most students in first year, and so by the time they're ready to graduate, they're doing some awesome project above and beyond me. So yeah. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, Pablo.
You too. Great to talk to you.